Everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for being here on such a frigid, typically Chicago January unpleasant day. Welcome to our discussion of Russia and the Arab world. As we planned this event earlier this fall, I initially had Israel and Palestine on my mind, but in that Russia and the Soviet Union obviously have a crucial role in the story of Israel and also in the articulation of various forms of Palestinian resistance. And I think that neither of these stories has yet adequately been told. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But the urgency of this event became even greater last month when Assad's government in Syria suddenly and quite unexpectedly fell, reminding us again of the crucial role that Russia has played in Syria's gruesome civil war and in propping up the regime for decades. Fortunately, we have experts today to help us understand these momentous events and decode them. And the panelists here have actually, I should say, really defined this as a vibrant field of its own, Russian Middle Eastern history. And they have edited a source book on the topic together called Russian Arab Worlds, a Documentary History, published by Routledge in 2023. Unfortunately, Eileen Kane has had to cancel for personal reasons, but we have two co-editors holding down the fort. Masha Kirasirova, who's seated in the middle, is assistant professor of history at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and the author of The Eastern International Arabs, Central Asians, and Jews in the Soviet Union's Anti-Colonial Empire, published by Oxford in 2024. She is also a co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of the Global 60s, Between Protest and Nation Building, Routledge 2018. Her work broadly explores exchanges between Soviet Eurasia and the Middle East, focusing on state-led efforts to transform the natural environment and political culture during the Cold War. Next, we have Margaret Litvin, who is an associate professor of Arabic and comparative literature at Boston University, a historian of trans-regional cultural flows. She is the author of Hamlet's Arab Journey, Shakespeare's Prince and Nasser's Ghost, 2011, and is writing a book entitled Red Mecca, The Life and Afterlives of the Soviet Arab Romance. Her research has been recognized with Mellon, ACLS Burkhardt, Humboldt, and Radcliffe Fellowships, and she has been awarded a 2023 Penheim Translation Fund grant to translate a Syrian Civil War novel featuring a giraffe, which sounds amazing. Can't wait to read it. Our discussion will be moderated today by our own Orit Bashkin, Mabel Green Myers, professor of modern Middle Eastern history. Orit is a historian who works on the intellectual, social, and cultural history of the modern Middle East and has written and edited multiple books on this theme. Some of these selections include New Babylonians, A History of Jews in Modern Iraq, 2012, and also Impossible Exodus, Iraqi Jews in Israel, 2017. Finally, and I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself earlier, I'm Faith Hillis, Director of Series. I would like to express immense gratitude to the co-sponsors of this event, which are CMES and the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. So I'm going to turn it over to these guys. I think they're going to have a sort of broad-ranging, informal conversation. We have other people who have things to contribute to the conversation, I know, in the room, so there should also be ample time. And finally, for those watching on Zoom, we can also field your questions online in the end, the Q&A period, and we will ask our panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will just situate our brilliant speakers in sort of the history and the historiography of the region for a couple of minutes, and then they will start their conversation between themselves. So just to say quickly that, when you dealt with Middle Eastern studies in previous years, you usually did like a Middle Eastern language, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, or Armenian, Greek, Aramaic, and so on. And you did a foreign language, which was mostly English and French. And this made sense because it spoke to a particular kind of multilingualism that was the result of the involvement of British and French empires in the region. If we think about colonial Egypt, if we think about colonial Algeria, if we think about the mandate system, if we think about intellectuals traveling abroad, writing in multiplicity of languages, these were sort of the multilingualisms that were aspired in the field. In recent years, however, there's a sort of a blessed historiographical and cultural shift that changed the picture quite dramatically. And I'm very thrilled that Masha and Margaret and Eileen Kane, who is not here, but I'm very thrilled that Masha and Margaret, who are here to talk about this historiographical shift. And I want to shout out here also to Faith and my colleague Holly Schisler and my colleague Leah Feldman, who also were a part of this shift in training students like Sam Hodgkins and Claire Rosin. And the shift is to look at Middle Eastern history through Russian sources and through Russian archives, but to look at at sort of Middle Eastern history and culture, not through Russian archives and Russian sources, not just to produce sort of Cold War politics and a very narrow intellectual history, but actually to look at a much more expensive global history and new forms of historical and literary inquiry. So the research that my two colleagues here were engaged with encompassed comparative literature, imperial, intellectual, social, gendered, and radical histories. And when we look at the things that they publish in their edited volumes and in their own work, we see how important Russia is to the Middle East. The studies of Eileen Kane and more recently of Vladimir Hamid Troyansky showed Russia as an empire with Muslim subjects, with Muslim peripheries, with Muslim rebellions, with Muslim pilgrims on the Hajj. It's very difficult to imagine the Ottoman state without Russian politics. The Ottoman state managed a huge refugee crisis coming from Central Asia. Their rivalry with Russia sort of shaped settlement policies, self-view, ideas of reform in the Ottoman Empire. Russian Muslim subjects shaped ideas about language, about subjecthood, about Islamic reform that later on circled back from the Russian Empire to the Ottoman Empire. So the histories and the kind of cultural studies that Masha and Margaret were engaged in were both local, and global. On the cultural sphere, we're talking about studies of the Russian Orthodox Church. If we are talking about Arab writers, we're talking not just about, individuals going to Paris and writing a travel account, but also individuals traveling from Nazareth to Moscow. We're talking about different types of translation of Dostoevsky, of Pushkin into Arabic and Turkish, moving to the 20th century. It's to think about poets like Nazim Hikmet together with Pablo Neruda and other radical poets. And here Margaret's research tells us a great deal about which writers are in Russia in a particular time and what are they doing. Now, we knew about some of these things from Arabic-based resources. So, for example, historian Ilham Khouri Makdisi showed radical networks of Arabs who were engaged in socialist and radical politics since 1860 onwards. But here we're talking about a completely different picture that gives us a much better sense about a socialist organization, communist movements, radical movements from the 19th century to the 1940s, to the Cold War. And by giving us the Russian vantage point, they sort of shed light on political and social networks, on new organizations. So if we think about what Masha wrote about Charlotte Rosenthal and her family, or what Margaret wrote about Najati Sidki, the Palestinian intellectuals who resided in the Soviet Union for a while, we get a much better sense of which intellectuals were trained in the USSR, where were they trained, how did the October Revolution affected the Middle East, how did Stalinism completely shattered Arab activists that were in the USSR. We understand how certain organizations like the School of the Toilers of the East or Afro-Asiatic conferences in the Soviet Union, inspired anti-colonial and anti-fascist movements in the Middle East. And we get a better understanding of Middle Eastern intellectuals and Middle Eastern activists through their networks that connect them also to people like Ho Chi Minh and Jomo Kenyatta and Harry Haywood. I'll just end by mentioning something that Faith started with, which is sort of Russia and the Middle East in relationship to Zionism. So there's a great emphasis on Zionism as a Western movement, the Dreyfus Affair, Herzl in Vienna, and so forth. But it's important to remember that the bulk of the settlers, at least until the 1930s, were actually Russian and Eastern European Jews from the Pale of Settlement, from Belarus, from the Ukraine. That the movement was spearheaded by people who survived the pogroms of 1881, 1882. And later on, if you look at Zionist writers, they write about the Kishinev pogrom or the Mendel Beilis affair, to such an extent that even Palestinians address some of these issues to show that they're not anti-Semitic and that they're actually in favor of someone like Mendel Beilis, but are still very critical of the Zionist movement. As Faith mentioned, we can't understand the formation of the State of Israel without the Soviet Union. We can't understand Israeli politics without thinking about Soviet about how sort of Israel negotiated its self-image as a socialist country and being part of an American sphere. We can't understand writings of Zionists like Jabotinsky without Russian. And so I just, from my sources recently, I just noticed that Sephardi and Palestinian Jews sometimes called the early Zionist migrants to Palestine Muscovites rather than Zionists. So that's very fascinating. But again, if we push it all the way to the 1990s, if we think about literary works by Alex Moshkin or about sort of bilingual Russian Hebrew work as discussed by Alex Moshkin, or if we think about sort of inner Jewish racial categories between Russian, Ethiopian, and Mizrahi Jews in the 1990s, this is all sort of related to these archives. So as someone who works on communist parties in the Middle East, but always see the Arab side and doesn't know what's happening in the Russian archives, I'm always reliant on the brilliance of the two scholars sitting next to me. And so I'm deeply, deeply excited about the opportunity to hear what they have to say. And thank you all for coming.
Wow. I'll stand up just to show slides. Wow. Thank you both so much. And Orit, that was amazing. As a survey and a context and a really inspiring justification of what the heck it is that we're actually trying to do here, which is that good? I'm hearing feedback. Which is to get around the framework of area studies as a way of studying the world, incidentally, to get around disciplinarity as well. But we'll start with area studies. Masha and I will talk you through this book more or less, and we will get, hopefully in the discussion, to some of the contemporary pressing issues that you identified, Faith, about how to think about, in particular, how to think about the Palestinian situation, where you have, for instance, Russian wives in Gaza who married Palestinian students and moved back, and who share a language and a cultural background and maybe not much else with post-Soviet people on the Israeli side, who have this kind of hidden channel of communication or non-communication. Or the Assad family, where Hafez al-Assad actually studied in the Soviet Union. He did flight school in Frunze, which is now Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And Assad's son just defended, in the middle of everything, a dissertation in mathematics at Moscow University, and how to think about the Russian and Soviet roots and ramifications there. So quickly, this is the University of Chicago, where I actually studied at the Committee on Social Thought, got my PhD here. This is how we do area studies. And so there's a Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies, of which we are very happy guests right now, and a Center for Middle Eastern Studies. This is my university, and how we chunk it. Again, somewhat random, depending on the personnel and who was inspired to start a program and how they coded it. But basically, what happens is that Central Asia, for instance, gets studied under the heading of Eastern Europe, even to some extent now, because Eastern Europe is kind of the post-Soviet, post-Eastern Bloc world. And then one sets out to edit a collection of primary sources on so-called Russian, so-called Arab ties, and discovers that, for instance, there are a great many Iraqi students studying oil engineering in Baku. Well, of course they are. There's oil and there's engineering, and also Baku is closer to Baghdad than it is to Moscow by a lot. And we also discovered in the process of editing this book how important it was that the Soviet republics in Soviet times had their own ministries of foreign affairs and were making their own foreign policy. And so what happened in Baku or in Yerevan was often only tangentially relevant to Moscow-based socialist internationalism, and much more often fed local interests using those Soviet-funded infrastructures. And we also discovered the limits of national history. This is a beautiful map that accompanies Vladimir Hamed-Troyansky's chapter in the book on the exodus of Muslim Russians from the Russian Empire, and how they landed in Anatolia and in Syria. And you realize that if you do national history, you can't get any piece of this, that you have to see it in some more continuous, holistic, regional and trans-regional way. And that this reframes how one studies the modern Middle East. So most courses on the modern Middle East, I think including the one I took here with Rashid Khalidi back in the day, start in 1798. Because the beginning of modernity to the Middle East arrives at the tip of Napoleon's cannon. And it turns out that actually the earliest European military intervention in the Eastern Mediterranean was not France at all. It was Russia helping a local independence movement, helping Ali Bey. And they besieged Palestine and Beirut. And for some reason, this is not talked about in how the Middle East was formed. It's always in the context of a bilateral understanding of the Middle East vis-a-vis the West. And so this is one thing that we're still trying to pick apart and draw attention to. So 25 years before Napoleon, there was Russian naval lieutenant Sergei Plisheyev with Orlov's fleet, with the blessing of Catherine the Great, doing this. So Masha's going to talk about the origin story. I'll stay up here 2 slides of how all this craziness came about and all the good people like Anna Dalingina who tried to talk us out of it.
Yeah, so thank you again for the invitation and the introduction. And I guess one of the things that is helpful to understand about this project was really the development of a collaboration and a research collaboration that you can see has been going on for over a decade. So the project really formally began in 2017 at a Boston University workshop that Margaret convened called Russia and the Arab World, History, Literature, and Arts. But it really, Margaret and I met at that first workshop in St. Petersburg in June 2013, where we met with Anna Dalingina, who's a scholar of Arabic literature. And this experience was dislocating and formative. I think for Margaret, this was one of the first times you had been back.
It was the only time I've been back to Russia since we fled in 1979.
And we were both, I guess, experiencing quite a bit of culture shock at this conference, and seeing kind of the idiosyncrasies of Russian academia at that time, the ways that the hierarchies. It's profoundly hierarchical, and Margaret's making a face. But we also we discovered this mutual interest. And then after that, we started presenting at conferences, and these were mostly area studies conferences. And we noticed pretty early on that at Mesa, there was almost never an audience. We'd get like 1 or 2 people. There was a much warmer reception in Slavic studies for whatever reason. I think this is there was more openness and more interest in the third world and decolonizing world, I guess socialism going global. This was an earlier trend. So we started doing this, but it was not easy to convince our friends in both of these area fields to try to have these conversations. And so I guess this was one of the reasons that at the BU workshop, it seemed like a good idea to really try and do something that would be more lasting, not just conference presentations, but something that could actually help train a new, hopefully, generation of students from the undergraduate level to the graduate level to actually see these connections, to actually teach these sources, have them ready for a Middle Eastern history class, for a Soviet history class, for global history. And that this would allow our communities of Middle Eastern and Slavic, Soviet, Eurasian studies to cross-fertilize more gradually. So, and the source book seemed like an easy and logical way to do this. Eileen Kane at that point joined our endeavor. She was the author of a prize-winning book about the Russian Hajj that bridged the imperial and early Soviet period and looked at mobility of pilgrims between Russian and Ottoman lands, and she was at the time becoming more interested in Middle Eastern history. And, we continued these conversations, I guess, all throughout COVID. We would meet and have regular meetings. And I guess, one of the things that we were thinking as we were gathering contributors was to try to make the organizing questions explicit and to engage core assumptions and then, periodize around these. So the questions were about the geopolitical context and big picture strategic alliances that made a particular event possible, the circulations of ideas and objects, and in what circulations this event participated, and how did it show the agency of individuals who moved across borders, adapted to new historical contexts, frames, and refashion themselves in this process.
I just want to interrupt very fast and say this is not an edited volume, properly speaking. It's a collection of primary sources with introductions. And because Eileen isn't here, we have to say her thing, which is she made every contributor, besides answering these questions, also answer the question of how does this reshape or reframe the received historiography in your field? There's a sort of non-trivial bar for admission to this collection.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that really, I think, also nicely came out of this workshop at BU and was reflected in the volume was the interdisciplinarity of this partnership. I mean, and this is reflected by the editorial, by the three editors. We have someone from Arabic literature, a kind of Middle Eastern Soviet historian, and an imperial Russian, Ottoman, trans-imperial historian. But we also, through these conversations, were quite deliberately open to people from global history, from art history, artists. And I guess one of the inspirations for the source book, and I think talked about this a long time ago, is the Picturing Russia source book, which I know, many people who teach Russian history have used in teaching, and I've used it successfully. And so, although the majority of the sources that we do introduce are logocentric, they're government documents or legal documents or pieces of literary text that are translated. We also have entries that highlight visual sources, like, for example, I don't know if we have Ala Yunus's photo essay on Yusuf Shaheen's 2 films about the Aswan High Dam. Shaheen shot key footage from the dam site for a fictional film in 1964, and even advised Nasser on the most telegenic moment to push the fateful button to release the water. But then when he completed the editing of the film, In 1968, both Egyptian and Soviet authorities rejected it for being too ideologically ambiguous, and he was forced to reshoot this film. And Ala Yunus actually, she colored these images and highlighted particular details about it. So it's both an essay about these two films that is comparative and a work of art by someone who's primarily an artist and who's actually been working on the Aswan Dam for and exhibiting art about it for over a decade. We also have an entry by art historian Suhaila Takesh, who about the Iraqi painter Mahmoud Sabri, who studied at the Surikov Art Institute as part of a larger context of foreign student programs. And you can see here there's themes and thematic kind of complementarity emerge with other entries, like, for example, by Konstantin Katsakioris about Arab students in the Soviet Union. And I really hope, you guys get to a chance to explore the collection and, consider using it in your teaching. In Suhaila's case, she really shows how Sabri mastered this, the technique, the painting technique, particularly the articulation of human anatomy. And he affirms his commitment to socialist realism and the idea that art needs to be rooted in reality, but he clashes with his teachers over interest in applying these uncomfortable themes for topics like martyrdom or civil strife. And then later in the 60s, he turns more to the relationship between art and science and the applications of the scientific method. But I think these images really, I guess the goal of including them was to try to offer, like the Picturing Russia sourcebook, an unmediated and, in this sense, untranslated access to primary sources to get students thinking about images as images and then integrating them into historical and cultural analysis. And, these sources complement other more kind of traditional historical sources. Either, for example, we have Rosen Jagalov's article. I've been teaching his articles for a really long time. He's also been a long fellow traveler on these panels with Margaret as we were developing the ideas for this collaboration and incubating them. But he's done a lot to connect post-socialist and post-colonial histories, literature and cinema studies. And his primary source translation is from Lotus Magazine, which we actually saw earlier today at the Chicago Institute of Art on display here. We have, for example, Mark Kramer's notes from a Soviet conversation with the Kuwaiti ambassador in 1990, which really reshapes our understanding of the perestroika period and the collapse as the Soviet, as the kind of
Kuwait is offering financial aid to the declining Soviet Union on the condition that it revise its diplomatic stance on Palestine.
Yeah. So you see this array. I mean, I guess I'll just highlight very.
So I want to say about the cover as the book is going around. That's also Mahmoud Sabri, and you can see it looks like a Russian icon. It's a picture of one of his martyred communist comrades from Iraq, but it's done in Russian icon style, and so that kind of encapsulates. Thank you, Indran. What we're doing here.
So I guess I'll talk about the next. I guess I.
What do you want to talk about?
The three entries. So I guess,
yours,
just to give a little bit more. So this is us.
This is the tower presence of Eileen Kane, who can be with us today.
So I guess Eileen and I really ended up bonding over this interest in Russian, trying to connect late imperial Russian modernization schemes with Soviet oil experts to the Middle East, which actually, so we ended up co-writing an article about oil exports to the Persian Gulf, spanning the late imperial to the early Soviet period. A second entry.
You could say oil exports to the Persian Gulf.
So before the discovery of oil in large quantities in Bahrain and Kuwait, I mean, the Soviet Union was actually exporting oil to the region.
To the Middle East was kerosene.
And in the the second entry was about Russia's the role in the emergence of the contemporary state system in the Middle East, where Russia has been really marginalized from most of, and it was marginalized from most of the diplomatic conferences that were convened in the aftermath of World War I, because the Bolsheviks had repudiated outstanding imperial debts to the Allies in 1917, and they signed the separate Brest-Litovsk Treaty with the Ottoman Empire in 1918. But in the spring of 1922, a Soviet delegation was invited to the Genoa Conference, convened in part to discuss the payment of Russia's debts, and then in fall 1922 to the Lausanne Conference, where they negotiated other treaties. And here you see the emissary of the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs, Lev Karahan, trying to establish diplomatic relations with the Hejaz, and are making this case to Stalin that we need to open up our relationship with this region because of the Muslim pilgrims from all corners of the world, including Soviet Russia, and so this, I guess, this was the story of Russia's involvement. However, it is limited, obviously, compared to the British and French. I think was, and the arguments for opening up these diplomatic ties then explains what's happening throughout the interwar period, where that relationship is in place until 1938, and also the ways in which then it gets revived in the 1990s. The other article that I just very quickly wanted to highlight was about a Syrian communist named Taha Sawaf, who came to Moscow from Syria in 1935. So this is luckily, this was after the Comintern, the Third Communist International, had created a section of cadres which had diligently chronicled and kept records for each person, for each dossier, which included their autobiographies. Can I have the next slide, please? So you can see here, this is Sawaf's autobiography. And these autobiographies have been used extensively by Soviet historians to study practices of self-introspection, self-narration, or what historian Ian Halfin has called the communist hermeneutics of the soul. And students often were asked to reflect on their professional lives, on their activities. But I guess what's interesting about the Kut foreign autobiographies is that they had to reflect on and translate these inter-imperial realities of their lives and their families, of their class, of race. So, for example, like Sawaf mentions, 2 of his family members are in the police. This does not prevent him from being beaten badly when he is arrested and taken to the police station for suspicion of communism. His nuclear family relationships are really difficult. His father called him apparently an imbecile, a loser, used insults. So you see there's quite a lot of pain in this personal story. And I guess it's interesting to contrast it with the interview that the Comintern officials do with Sawaf as a kind of follow-up that explain that the reasons for this was that his mother was an African slave whom his father had purchased on a trip to Mecca and took as his second wife, and that it was Sawaf's race and coloration that made both his family life so painful and his experience in Syrian factories also very difficult, which then ends up pushing him to communism and brings him to the Soviet Union, where he becomes he graduates from KUTF and becomes an expert on the East. So he works initially for an Oriental Institute, and where he's actually critiquing Soviet Orientalists who are writing mostly on, analysis of, for things like the assault of imperialist reaction on the people of Syria. He, he points out 16 different types of errors that this Soviet Orientalist expert makes, such as, for example, his condescending references to native industry and natives as opposed to a national industry or, a national bourgeoisie. Later, he's recruited to work as a translator for the Soviet armed forces. And then I don't have that document up here, but in the end, he ends up working for Moscow Radio in the post-war period, producing radio shows in Arabic about Iraqi poets, about other writers. So translating and engaging with Arabic culture for, as part of the Soviet Cold War cultural outreach. So you get these incredible stories of people who are translating between different imperial contexts. So it's a very, I think it's a trans-imperial story. You see the kind of real-time decision making that these people had to take. And I think it's been for me very helpful for teaching. So I was already translating and using these sources in my own courses, alongside now Margaret has just translated the memoirs of Nejati Sidqi, which are coming out with Texas University Press. So this is another source that I've also been using bits of translations from, but Margaret has very helpfully now produced the entire narrative. So, and over time, students really start to, to write papers with this, to look for other sources, to explore. So it becomes a kind of springboard for that kind of work.
Yeah. How long should we go on? Because I kind of don't want to eat up all the time.
More time, and then we should probably 5 minutes or so open the floor to questions.
Okay, great. Yeah. And Masha forgot to mention her new book.
I mean,
Also with Oxford, like the source book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this work has been, the nice thing about it is that it has been developing in parallel to our monographs and to all sorts of other side projects. So now, for example, one of the artists that I mentioned earlier, Alat Yunus, and I are working together on an art exhibit about the Aswan Dam. So this has led to other sort of, collaborations. I mean, it has helped me tremendously with my own work, in part because I think coming together and bringing all these people together, I learned a whole lot, but it also, you get the sense that you're working as part of a collective, that you are doing something that is much bigger than, your own little desk and office and thought process. So it's been wonderful to be able to have this research collective, I guess. Yeah.
Far and wide. Watch us replicating in some ways the thing that we study, with multilingual teams of scholars, with a centrality of translation, with this kind of Afro-Asian and European emphasis, in some ways following research that has been done for us already by the Soviet Union, by Comintern officials and so on, right? And in some ways asking some of the same questions that are asked in those files. I'm a literature person, so I could go on all day, and I won't, about the individuals that this project has introduced me to. This is Sheikh Mohammed Ayed Tantawi, who was one of the first Arabs to teach Arabic inside Russia in 1840. And he wrote a travelogue about it. This is the same time that the very famous travelogue of France was coming out. And he also taught vulgar Arabic, that is Ammiya, Egyptian colloquial Arabic, and he had a sentence in there in his grammar book. يعني السن ماهوش عريض زي النفا. So he's explicitly comparing the France travel experience, the Seine, to the Niva, as foreign destinations for modernizing Arab consciousness. Kulthum Alda, who is just amazing. Just go read everything about her that you can in Arabic and in Russian and in that book. Who starts out as a dark, unwanted girl child in a family in Nazareth and finds her way through Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society schools, of which there were over 100, and they taught girls, into the Russian orbit, marries a Russian doctor named Vasilyev, becomes Claudia Oda Vasilyevna. Vasilyev drops dead, unfortunately, leaving her with little kids to support. She does various things and eventually starts teaching Arabic and becomes the right-hand woman of Ignacy Krachkovsky, whose youngest student was Anna Dolenina. So this is Kulthum Alda at the beginning of that tradition. Eventually, she gets a Brezhnev Award, a state medal. This is 1964, I think, shortly before her death. All of these characters who use, again, this infrastructure, the growing infrastructure of Arab Russian and then Arab Soviet. So after the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society period, there's the Communist University of the Toilers of the East period, KUTF, what Masha talked about. And then there's the Khrushchevian internationalism period starting in 1961. And that infrastructure grows every decade, even after you'd think the post-colonial states don't need help anymore. More and more of their students get scholarships to study in the Soviet Union. And they write memoirs eventually, which are hilarious. They talk about the disgustingness of Soviet bathrooms, for instance, and how there are no doors on the stalls. And what is this? This is an empire rich in wood. Why can't they build bathroom doors, people? And you get writers who occupy some kind of oblique relationship to their Russian training, but still have made use of it in honing their own novelistic technique. This is Khalil Raz, the author of the giraffe novel I'm translating. We met in Berlin in the summer of 23. And so he studied and then worked in Leningrad and then in Moscow. He returned to live in Damascus. Now he's a refugee in Brussels. And his book is called The Russian Quarter, and it makes use of Russian characters. And he's also translated Chekhov into Arabic. And he completely denies the relevance of any of this. He pushes back hard when you ask him about it. When you ask him about his Russian and Syrian selves, he's like, what kind of a stupid question is that? That interview is in the edited, in the source book as well, where he says, am I really Russianized? Am I really Syrian? I carry a little bit of everybody I've ever talked to. I'm a hybrid person par excellence. And so it's those hybrid people that make this project really wonderful. I am finishing a book on a lot of them, including Khalil, and on the way that this Russian and Soviet experience has been respun and reimagined now by 21st century writers. People, many of them my age or younger, who didn't personally live that experience, but who are, for instance, like Alexandra Shraita over here, are themselves products of it, with one Lebanese parent and one Russian parent. So that, and we're delighted to see scholars continuing to talk about this. Going global with the study of socialism, studying, I love this title, the gritty politics of the particular, these spaces like the bathrooms, the kitchens, the hallways, the dorms, the stairwell of the Kutf dormitory where Nazim Hikmet, Najati Sidqi, and Emi Siao hung out in the 1920s. And also pushing this research forward, Masha and I recently finished editing, and should be out any day, a roundtable in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, pushing some of this outward into Algeria, forward into 2015 Aleppo and Russian war correspondents embedded there, and so forth. So I don't know, yeah, let's stop and discuss.
Any questions? Any questions?
Thank you all for this. This is amazing and really exciting to think with in all sorts of ways. So, I mean, I was thinking as you were sort of talking about what you're doing to the accepted frames of area studies about other framing premises that I don't know, I've been thinking about in our discipline, and one of them has to do with the kind of generally allergic reaction of practicing professional historians and institutions like this to military history. And so I'm sort of, I mean, there's an ulterior motive to this, so I'll ask the question in a straightforward way and a less straightforward way. So the first question is just sort of given the history of military ties as a kind of another mode of connection in this story, how you all have chosen to think about and deal with that, both in relation, I mean, to your own interests and to the kind of challenges that sometimes come with doing that kind of research. And I guess connected to that has to do with the fact that at least through the Soviet period, my understanding is that, I mean, military goods are costly capital goods that represent a kind of movement of objects in a world where exchange with the Soviet Union was not mediated by apex currencies under the Bretton Woods system, and therefore was hugely significant to the development agendas and problems of regimes in many other parts of the world. And so that like military goods, because they were costly, had kind of non-military implications as well. So I don't know. I'm curious about all the military stuff and the people that were moving it around.
Thank you for that question. I mean, this also just came up in the AHR review. I don't know if you read that as well, but you're not the first one to point this out as, and I guess, and I actually agree with the reviewer. I think we said, at the time, like, oh, it's been done, but then the things we cited were really from the Cold War period. I mean, part of the curation of the volume had to do with who we knew that was working on different kinds of topics. And we looked far and wide. I mean, we looked on social media. We had presented on this stuff at different conferences for decades. Some of these came out when, we were presenting to groups of people, and people would just come up and say, oh, I actually have a source, and we'd invite them along. It was a lot. We didn't know that many military historians, or I guess that we didn't come across that. Certainly not ones that were thinking about the circulation of these goods in the way that you just described as like embedded and, connected to political economy. I mean, we have one, Ginor and Rema's entry about the role of the Soviet-Egyptian relationship kind of in the lead up to the 1973 war. And that is also, we took them on understanding that it was a controversial argument, that I think, and this was, but I guess part of the controversy and people push back saying there was lots of evidence that the advisors had been kicked out in 1972, and that that they're really overstating the case to the extent to which the Soviet Union was kind of still operating and kind of complicit with what Egypt was doing in the lead up to 1973. I think the fact that this is still like a controversial issue suggests that I don't know, that people are still arguing about it. I mean, I think it's enough to show that this is kind of still a live debate. And so, which is why we decided to include it, even though it was, we understood that, there were a lot of people that disagreed with it, but it was one of the few kind of groups of, it was people who did military history. I guess the Mark Kramer also, I mean, they're talking about getting, Soviet aid and, intervening in Iraq and how to manage that conflict, and so the military is in the background there, but it's, I think it's really important because it was also such a huge percentage of what the Soviet Union was producing, like just in terms of goods and what of the development aid, what a large percentage, that it occupied. But it was really, I guess we were limited, with well, I don't know, maybe there'll be other students that will do this in the future, and that, we can, I mean, as we showed with the IJMIS thing, like we wanted to keep this going, and we wanted to continue to have these conversations. We reached out to graduate students whom we included that are working on this now, to show that this is kind of an ongoing and evolving conversation field, but yeah, this was, I don't know, we never really tried to go to like a military history, conference.
No, what you're describing sounds incredibly helpful. And whenever somebody says, "Oh, why didn't you include?" Obviously, the answer is please. Like we were not trying to be definitive. We were trying to prove a concept that this is interesting, that this is a field, and there's something there. And then coming back and looking at the military ties and gifts from that vantage point.
But I have to say, I guess one of the reasons I decided to, like, I pushed for including the remez it was because they were actually using, they found all these memoirs and diaries of Soviet veterans who were writing often under other names, that were published, that's be published around the periods when it became, because it was also censored in the Soviet Union, and there were times where spaces and places, and kind of embedded it in the historiography of opening of, of the 90s and, the 80s and 90s. So for that reason too, it was valuable, because of the but yeah, no, it's not easy to find.
Anyone else in the crowd have a question? I'll pass it to you, and then
Yes,
I think that one died.
Oh,
it just got turned off.
So there's a particular thing I'm curious about, and I think it ties into a broader thing. Something you mentioned early on was that in the early pre-1948 stages, quite a lot of the Jews that came to what would become Israel were from Russia, and they basically brought Marxism with them initially. And then at a certain point, I'm not sure exactly when or exactly how it happened, but they went from being aspirationally communist to like a full capitalist turn, and they've been quite successful economically doing that, which I'm sure the Soviet Union did not like very much. I'm wondering, like, when that happened and how it happened, and how that compares to other places in the region, like Iran and maybe a couple other places where there was a solid push for the communist revolution, and then in other cases it also didn't really take in the long term. So what's the particular with Israel and their turn? And how does that compare with other places where there might be some comparisons and maybe some differences as well?
When is this capitalist turn? What capitalist turn?
The one in Israel, where they ceased to be a aspirationally communist state and just the full embrace of capitalism. I think it was in the 70s broadly. I'm not totally sure though.
Not sure. I'll provide the. Okay, so I'm not a part of the book, so I rather that they talk about the book. But I'll say very quickly, and you can correct me because you actually wrote the Oxford book on the issue. Is that there are various shades of labor Zionism, from the get-go of the movement, especially since the wave of what is called the second Aliyah. They're socialist, they're communist, there are immense differences between them. Regardless of the ideology after 1948, Ben-Gurion strives to be in the American sphere of influence. In terms of like espousing liberal politics, criticizing the socialism of labor Zionism. That comes in the late 70s with the rise of the right-wing party, Likud. But this is a very sort of simplistic explanation of what's going on there, because in terms of the historiography, there are explorations of, economic policies, relations, ties, the complicated relationship of the Israeli Communist Party with the Soviet Union, the complicated relationship between sort of labor Zionism and communism, the different shades of labor Zionism. So I think that it's much more complicated. But I'm saying this from as someone who actually doesn't look at the at Russian archives. So that's based on Hebrew and Arabic. But I actually wanted to ask you if I have the mic. So what's happening now with the war in Ukraine? So how do you train students to go to archives that are not accessible, perhaps, or so? And then how is your book, you think, fit into this new attempt to both decolonize archives, but also study Russia, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union from outside of the center? So where does it fit?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'm not training graduate students. I've been on, I can serve on committees as an outside reader, but we don't have PhD students where I teach. But I guess if I did, and I have recently, like at the American Historical Association conference, I met with someone who's excited to do a PhD in history. And was actually really inspired by one of the sources from this book about Baku, the foreign ministries, and about all of the Arab students that were studying in Baku. And he told me that he, wanted to write about this and is applying for archival access to the ministry, to the state archive in Baku, and the foreign ministry archive, which people in our book have had access to and have worked in, and many people also. And so that, I mean, there are a lot of archives in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, in Europe, that have these treasure troves. And in terms of Ukraine, I mean, they've been digitizing the security services archive. I mean, this process is, they keep it very hush hush, but it's, they've been working on it, and it's, I know people who have had access to it and have worked in that archive, with multiple types of passports, and hopefully it will become more accessible digitally. The challenges with Middle Eastern history and archival access haven't changed that much. I mean, there's there are people, I know people working in Iraqi archives, or traveling there and working there. I mean, it's not clear what's going to happen in Syria. You see these photographs of all of the archival documents of the prisons scattered all around the floor, and people just picking through it and looking for their loved ones. It's and there's also evidence of collaboration between Ukraine and the Syrian regime around food security issues, possibly Sorry?
The new Syrian regime.
Yeah, the new Syrian regime. Yeah, since Assad has been toppled, I don't know if they would follow the Ukrainians and going and digitizing all of the the dirt on of the Assad regime. I mean, that's my personal fantasy. I'm not sure it's gonna work out that way, but we don't really know what's gonna happen.
I mean, I think there's a certain amount of resourcefulness that inaccessibility invites, using other kinds of sources, using memoirs or even oral histories. Konstantin Katsakouris did a ton of research in the KGB archives in Kiev before the full-scale invasion, because that's where the KGB archives were accessible. And so he had all these reports of like hate crimes against Arab and African students and so on, not because they happened disproportionately in Ukraine, but because that's where he could see the documentation and the way that the regime kept tabs on foreigners, which stepped up very sharply after Chernobyl, for instance. So you always find something interesting when you look from outside the center. I'm also not training graduate students right now, but I would say if you are, it's a long-term proposition, and just learn a bunch of languages and work somewhere. Rachel Applebaum is doing research for her book on Russian as a global language, on Russian teachers around the world, among other places in Estonia, because that's where she can get to archives right now.
We have a question online, so I'm going to go ahead and read that. It's about inter-Arab historical divergence. In the mid to late 20th century, a clear divide emerged as Gulf Arab states gradually aligned with the US and Britain, while many Levantine Arab states turned to the Soviet bloc. What key factors, historical ties, political, economic, or ideological, drove these contrasting foreign policy decisions, and how did these alignments shape inter-Arab rivalries, for example, on Palestine? Furthermore, to what extent did clandestine operations or false flag efforts by external powers or rival Arab regimes influence these alliances and the broader dynamics within the Arab world?
Wow. This person should write an article.
Can you just repeat the second part of the question?
Yes.
The last part.
To what extent did clandestine operations or false flag efforts by external powers or rival Arab regimes influence these alliances and the broader dynamics within the Arab world?
I mean, there's a literature about the Arab kind of the Cold War, the Arab Cold War, and the explaining and some of these relationships and historicizing them. I think that for the Gulf states, I mean, the oil interests were pretty strongly articulated and connected from the kind of the World War II period onward. I mean, the Saudi had a communist party. There were histories of communist parties, but actually, from what from the little I've looked in the Soviet archives about Gulf communist parties, I haven't seen nearly as much as on the communist parties in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Palestine, obviously. I think this is a really promising and interesting area of research. I mean, I have colleagues working on the history of the left in the Gulf who are very interested in leftist sources, but also in other kinds of illiberal alliances that the Gulf was pursuing. Mohammed al-Sudairi has written about some of this with powers in East Asia that were also aligned with the United States. So it was very much part of a kind of a Cold War politics in the region. I'm not sure that I don't even think we can clearly say that the Levantine states were really aligned with the Soviet Union, because I mean, just because of how messy and complicated the politics were. I mean, there were parties that were aligned. Some countries received Soviet aid at certain periods, but that alliance was always deeply frustrating to Soviet leaders, because even though these countries were receiving tons of aid, they rarely did what the Soviets actually wanted them to do. They flaunted Soviet interests in a number of ways, and cut their own deals, and often played the superpowers off of one off the other. So, you know, I guess I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure like what the sort of what else there is to explain. I mean, we can trace the economic interest, we can show the complexity, and people are working on this. But I think the Gulf in this period was, very under researched. It was funny. I was just talking to our former advisor. It was yesterday, and I'm starting to read a lot more in Gulf history. I mean, I've been there for a decade now, and I was making fun of him. I was like, it took me like a decade of living in this place to start, to get over the kind of Levantine, like Egyptian bias that we were trained in, to actually see how incredibly interesting and rich and exciting and complicated this place is. And he agreed. He said, yes, that, he said we all thought that way in Middle Eastern history. Like he was like, everybody, we all thought that way. And, 20 years ago, it did not seem possible. So I think there's a lot of really exciting new work coming out in Gulf history now, and it seems like in the next kind of wave of graduate students. So I think hopefully we'll also get a much more nuanced and interesting narrative about the Arab Cold War. And I think part of it is also the under research, that the Soviet parts are under researched compared to, the ways in which we think about American empire, for example, in the Gulf, from books like America's Kingdom, or Timothy Mitchell's work on carbon democracy. We have come to really understand dynamics of American empire from these works in this incredible way. And we don't yet have anything even approaching that for the Soviet side, and let alone like, actually putting these things together. So I think we're still a little bit of ways from giving a better answer to that question.
May I actually ask a quick kind of follow up to that, but also veering off in a different direction? As people have mentioned, since the full scale invasion in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about decolonizing the field and what that would mean and what that would look like. And it seems like your book is providing ample evidence of Russia and the Soviet Union as a colonialist, imperialist actor in the world, right? Like I had no idea this, that Russia had bombarded Palestine in 1772. That's crazy. Like that's totally news to me, and no one talks about that stuff. Yet at the same time, the book also provides ample evidence of people looking to the Soviet Union as an anti-colonial savior, and there seems to be there's a paradox there. So I don't know if, again, this goes kind of beyond the purview of the book, but how you think your book may weigh in on that discussion about decolonization and imperialism in Russian history.
Very quickly, like my program has always been to historicize both the pseudo weird, coloniality of the Soviet Empire, and also all of the decolonizing trends, both domestically and internationally. I mean, I that's what I try to do in my monograph, is to kind of to show how it was dynamic, how these things changed over time, how there were times when decolonization was more in vogue, both ideologically and rhetorically, but also as a form of politics. There were other times where it was repressed, other times then it came back. So I think we really need to, I think it's helpful to understand the kind of twists and turns of how people have used these concepts and lived with them, before we can, I think a lot of the sort of the early, let's just decolonize the field, like people just, I thought that people weren't even sure that they what they meant, or if they were using the term in a way that allowed them to have a productive conversation with one another, because they were using it to mean different things, or, you know, importing models from, you know, from post-colonial studies developed about other empires that functioned totally differently because they were capitalists. They were, you know, their, you know, extraction mechanisms were different. This, you know, everything was different. So I think it's still helpful to historicize this. And I think this is how I personally see the contribution, both of my monograph and the source book. But maybe Margaret has.
I mean, the field of post-colonial studies itself, outside the Russian and Soviet context, has gone through a kind of evolution, from looking in a deterministic kind of binary way at the colonizer and the colonized, to being aware of colonial networks and infrastructures that, again, individuals can use and can play off. And proxy war is a terrible thing for ordinary people, but imperial competition is a wonderful thing. And if you're a writer and you can, you know, publish in a Congress of Cultural Freedom journal, and in a Soviet-funded journal, great. And so, again, I think one way out of this is to think from the ground, from individuals using things off-label and against the empire's designs in whatever period. Eileen Kane's first chapter in the source book from the 19th century, before any Aliyah, has a case of this, where the Russian Empire creates pilgrim passports for Russian Orthodox pilgrims to develop their emotional connection to the Holy Land. And these pilgrim passports are used in this very unorthodox way by Jews who want to get away from pogroms. Not because they're Zionists and not because they're Orthodox Christians, but because this passport is available and, oh my God, let's use it. And so I think taking that perspective and worrying less about the shape of the field opens up all kinds of surprises.
Questions? Yes. One moment, sorry, they can't hear online.
Yeah, sorry. First of all, thank you so much for the talk and for the book. Looking forward to read it as well. About this question about decoloniality, I think there is mixed up between decolonization as a political movement and decoloniality as a epistemic movement. I think here we are not talking about decolonization and anti-colonial movement in the 60s and 50s. We're talking about epistemically, right? So, and that will lead me to the centrality of the language itself.
Sure.
Here, this is not, I need a clarification or like explain from you. Like today we use Soviet Union / Russia, but most of the contest was about the 60s and 50s and 19th century. So, Edith, are you talking about the Soviet Union as a political entity or about Russia as the language? And if we use Russia to refer to Russian language, what about the other community you're talking about? You're talking about Azerbaijan, you're talking about Kazakhstan, blah, blah, blah. So here, what exactly is Russia in the title referring to? And if you reflect on that in the introduction. And the second question about today, and this about the new imperialism, because you kindly mentioned, Masha, about different dynamics of imperial and how it works. What exactly Russia did in Syria? What you call this? And how we move forward from 8th of December to tomorrow, or what is going on in Syria, and hopefully we will not see another civil war in Libya where also Russia will intervene. Thank you.
Oh, we're looking through our introduction to find the paragraph in which we address your first question, because we worried about it a lot. How do you title this crazy grab bag of a collection? What is the thing that we're actually studying? And we came up with, oh gosh, yes. And we came up with this story about what we mean by Russian Arab worlds, which is Russian, we're using in a geographic sense to mean lands historically inhabited by Russian speakers, and also the wider kind of Eurasian spaces, which are religiously and ethnically diverse, that were conquered by the Tsarist and then the Soviet regime and ruled from St. Petersburg and Moscow. So including the Russian space and the Soviet space, which overlap but not entirely, and including Arabic-speaking parts of the Russian space, like Chechnya and Dagestan. No, they do. Yes, it's used as a lingua franca, and there's scholarship in it. I mean, it's a written language, and there are valuable works written in it, even if it's not spoken every day. Actually, Kulthum Auda went and studied a group of Arabs in Central Asia who spoke some Arabic, who were native to that region, and she was very ethnographically interested in how they lived. And likewise, by Arab, we don't mean Arab. We mean, for instance, it includes Kurdish speakers within Arab lands. We mean the Arab majority, but internally diverse societies, basically overlapping the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire and the post-Ottoman successor states. And we could have written a lot about North Africa, but there wasn't. Our editor at Oxford said stop. So how to define these things is, yeah, it's not trivial. And how you cast the net determines what you catch. Do you want to talk about Syria and Libya?
Well, I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily confusion between the epistemic decolonization and the kind of political history of anti-colonial movements, because they were, I mean, if you think about they were actually connected. Through supporting these movements, and even before they were really, even before 1945, by thinking about this. I mean, the international communists, the students, the Bolsheviks, a lot of people thought a lot about what decolonization could and should look like. And yeah, they didn't have the final say, right? Like, we're still, I mean, obviously the conversation about epistemic decolonization is, in full swing, but the investments into supporting people interested in decolonizing abroad shaped the history, the epistemic history of anti-colonial thought, of decoloniality, of Marxist critiques of, of power of the Orient, that then kind of circulate back into Edward Said, and are ignored in Russia because everyone's already heard them before, because it's like old news that people have been saying this stuff for decades. So I still think that even, that it's not confusion, that we actually need to historicize both the kind of the intellectual history of decoloniality and the Soviet role in it, and also, the 20th century history of the processes of decolonization, in which the Soviet Union played a role, but so did, a lot of other powers, and actors and people. And I guess our goal here was, to, as Margaret said, I think, focus on individuals, illustrate complexity, show the limitations of, the kind of the epistemic, organization of our field and area studies, and to have that conversation. But I actually do think that it's the confusion is part of that history, and it was deliberate. This confusion was something that the Soviet Union wanted to produce because it didn't want people asking questions about its status as an empire, about, how colonial it was. It wanted that to be impossible to think about. Right. And we are asking these questions, and others and students are asking these questions, and artists and, activists and all over Central Asia and Ukraine and and other parts of this world are asking these questions. But I think that they're linked, and it's hard to kind of separate them out. But I think that's what we have to historicize is these linkages.
Yeah, I just want to add 2 words to what Masha just said, which are in her book title, Anti-Colonial Empire. And yeah, so if you take the Marxist categories that in order to be imperialist, you have to be capitalist, this rules out the idea that the Soviet Union could be imperialist, which is very convenient and nice when you're doing things like, or even in the post-Soviet period now, disproportionately drafting people from Muslim majority and minority majority regions of Russia to send them to die in Ukraine. Classic empire behavior that is invisible to those who accept the classic economic model of empire, that the Soviet Union in a way exported to us. And so part of the shape of our post-colonial, our Said-influenced post-colonial studies bears, this is Masha's work, this is the work of Vera Tolz, Russia's own Orient, bears the stamp of that. And so that is part of what we still have to understand.
So I also wanted to mention, as someone who works on Iraq, that sometimes the specific categories about sort of anti-colonial, Soviet, Russian were not clear to people in the Middle East who espouse pro-Russian or pro-Soviet positions. So, for example, in Iraq, in the end of World War I, you found people who have associations in northern Iraq were Shiites for Kemalism and Bolshevism. When you get to the 40s, where the Communist Party is really popular, you get on the sort of upper echelons, very serious debates about decolonization and oil and how to create revolution in a society that is not capitalistic, and they're deeply, deeply influenced by the former head of the party, who was executed in 1949, who was also trained in the University of the Toilers of the East. So you have this in very serious debates, and whether we should revolutionize the army and what should we do, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you also have, people who refer to Stalin as Abu Shawarib, like Mr. Mustache, and they just identify him with somebody who is, anti-German, if this is in a poor Jewish neighborhood, or you have people who show up for strikes or see themselves as communists, but they just know that these are the people who will come to the factory in times of strike. So I think that, within the Middle East, you have, again, in Iraq at least, you have people who are trained in the Soviet Union, you have people who speak to a particular anti-colonial history and historiography. So they talk about, about World War I, World War II as the Soviet war against Hitlerism, and impose a very specific narrative. But you have people who come up with their own interpretations and their own ideas, and it depends on the class, and it depends on the Arab state, and it depends within the Arab state on the city and the province, and whether it's an oil refinery or whether it's in where it is. So I think there are many factors that shape, at least from the Arab perspective, how people think about decolonization and empire and the role of sort of Soviet influence in their lives.